Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's broadcast. Joining me here in Boston today is Katie Davies, Senior Director of Advisory Services at Radius. Katie oversees Radius's advisory client engagements across 5 continents with expertise in a wide variety of cross-border issues, including HR, tax, intellectual property, and immigration consulting. I'd also like to introduce Sheehan, who is Head of Tax at Radius. Lee leads the provision of all tax services delivered by Radius. He has over 20 years of experience advising companies on a broad range of tax compliance and planning matters. Lee is joining us today from London. Hi, Lee.
Hello there. Hi.
Before we get started in earnest, I just wanted to mention that we'll be sharing some links during the broadcast to materials that may prove helpful answering some of the questions that have come in. We'll also share those assets via our Twitter page at RadiusWW using the hashtag #GlobalGrowth. We'll make those assets available to you during the broadcast through the chat window. Okay, now on to our attendees' questions. Katie, a question has come in on the topic of entity setup from Marie. Marie asks, or she states that she's going into a country and she'd like to send one person, but she's not sure that they're going to stay there beyond a single year, and she doesn't want to register an entity. What do you advise?
Okay, thanks, Ed. So a nice broad question, which really kind of encompasses a lot of what we look at each day around global expansion and doing business internationally. And the real question here is which country, because each country, different continents have different provisions and tendencies. So, for example, it may be possible, depending on the country, to simply register a payroll only for an individual to be able to account for their payroll taxes. And really what we're looking at here is 2 things in the short term. One is, how do you pay somebody? How do you account for the local payroll taxes, Social Security? And how do you employ them to make sure that they are legal in country? So the next question that I would then ask is actually, are we talking about an expatriate, somebody who is sent from one country to another country for a period of time? Or are we actually looking at hiring somebody who's essentially a local hire in country already? And the answers may be very different. So, for example, in Singapore, there isn't actually a requirement for foreign nationals or expats to actually have payroll withholding. So in order to be able to work there for a year, you just simply need a work permit, but you wouldn't need necessarily to register a payroll. In other countries, for example, the UK, it would be necessary to actually have a payroll and apply with what's called real-time information payroll reporting. So I'm afraid it's a very general answer. It will depend on the country. It will depend on whether it's a local hire or an expatriate employee. And then in terms of other arrangements, you might want to look at something like a contractor to see if that's a viable option, or even what's called a PEO, a professional employment organization, which could act as a third-party employer of record for a short period of time. And again, the appropriateness of all that will very much depend on your business operations, what you're trying to achieve, as well as looking at the activity that's going to be performed to see whether or not the activity itself might need some sort of business license or permission to undertake that activity. So, for example, in the not-for-profit sector that we deal a lot with, there may be an obligation to obtain certain permits in country to do things like good works, research, training locally, and you may need some government visas or permits to do that. So again, a lot of the answers to that question will very much depend on countries, activities, and what you're doing. And then the final piece of all that is looking at the nature of the activities and whether or not there's a requirement under corporate tax legislation to do something more than just paying somebody. And what I mean by that is, does the activity create what we call a corporate tax nexus or a permanent establishment in country? So Lee, I don't know if you want to just pick up on that point.
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Katie. So I think, as Katie said at the very beginning, probably the lightest touch way into a country is when you've got one individual or 2 individuals is through a payroll registration. and that usually just limits the extent of your liability to payroll taxes and social security contributions. However, you will have somebody in that country on the ground undertaking some activity, and therefore there is a possibility that you have created some other form of tax presence, a business tax presence, that could create a tax liability to corporate income taxes. Again, as Katie has sort of alluded to, it's very country specific as to how they view this. There are some sort of general guidelines and certainly some do's and don'ts that apply in many countries in terms of trying to make sure you don't accidentally trigger any kind of other tax presence in that country. But what we're finding is that these payroll-only registrations, liaison offices or rep offices, as they're sometimes called, they are coming under a bit of pressure from tax authorities, and they are starting to be being scrutinised a lot more. And really the context to that, it's all part of the picture that I think we all know and we see in the news and the media. You know, government budgets have come under pressure. Tax raising is under pressure. So any opportunity that they can get to attract profit into their country or attract income into their country and to tax it, that they will do that. Some countries have clearly defined rules around whether something can be a payroll registration or not. Others, quite a lot of them, it's quite subjective. So you do need to be careful about understanding what your risk profile is in terms of any other taxable presence in those country in the country that you're operating in.